Versailles, June 28, 1919. The air in the Hall of Mirrors is heavy, saturated with expensive perfume and the sensation of victory. Outside, thousands of people crowd the palace gates, believing they are witnessing the birth of peace. Inside, the fate of the 20th century is about to be sealed in ink and paper. The German minister Hermann Müller walks to the central table with measured steps, followed by a delegation without uniforms, without flags, without smiles. No country had been invited to the table to negotiate its own punishment, only to sign it. Before him, the Treaty of Versailles, 440 articles that turned defeat into humiliation and peace into a sentence. The victors, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, look on coldly. Each wants something different: the French, revenge; the British, stability; the Americans, an ideal of justice that already seems distant. The war had ended months ago, but it was still alive in their gazes. Müller takes a deep breath. He knows that refusing to sign would mean the immediate return of hostilities. Signing, on the other hand, means accepting exclusive blame for the First World War, paying unimaginable reparations, and completely disarming Germany. He hesitates for an instant, but the pressure is absolute. At 3:12 p.m., the pen touches the paper. The sound of metal scraping on parchment echoes like a verdict. Applause fills the hall. The world believes it has witnessed the end of the war. But what is born there is only a pause, a disguised truce. The moment the German minister lifts his eyes, he knows what history books will confirm decades later. That signature did not end the war, it merely postponed it. John Maynard Keynes, the young British economist present at the negotiations, watches in silence. He sees what others do not. Years later, he would write, "The economic consequences of the peace are more grave than those of the war." He knows that numbers killed too. And the treaty's numbers, 132 billion marks in reparations, unpayable interest, confiscation of land and resources, amount to condemning an entire generation to misery. As the cannons fall silent, the poison begins to spread. Germany loses 13% of its territory, all its colonies, much of its coal and steel, the backbone of its economy. The army is limited to 100,000 men, warplanes and tanks are prohibited. Each restriction is a reminder of defeat, a daily prompt of impotence. In Berlin, the news arrives like a second defeat. Crowds take to the streets not to protest, but to mourn. The national pride that had sustained the country for centuries is now a shattered mirror. The Weimar Republic is born under this weight, fragile, ashamed, trying to govern a people that no longer believes in itself. In the following months, the mark collapses. Inflation turns into a nightmare. Families carry money in wheelbarrows to buy bread. Children play with bills as if they were worthless toys. People burn notes to keep warm because it's cheaper than buying firewood. Economic humiliation mixes with moral, and resentment begins to ferment in silence. But the forgotten mistake is not just the punishment, it is the blindness. The victors believe that fear will sustain the peace, that a broken nation will never fight again. They do not realize that despair is more dangerous than power. And while the powers celebrate their triumph, an entire country begins to search for culprits, leaders, explanations. Amid the chaos, a man begins to find his voice in the beer halls of Munich. A veteran of the First World War, without fortune or formal education, but with an unusual skill, transforming collective frustration into speech. His name is still irrelevant in 1919, but within a few years he will become the living symbol of everything the Treaty of Versailles tried to erase. Because in the end, the document that promised to secure world peace did not create justice, it created revenge. And revenge is a seed that never dies. The war ended on paper, but in the streets of Germany it merely changed form. There were no more trenches, but there were hunger queues. There were no cannons, but there was the dry sound of printing presses churning out bills that were already worthless. The country that had once been an industrial powerhouse had become a feverish organism trying to survive with an economic heart beating out of rhythm. The Treaty of Versailles did not merely strip away territories and resources, it stripped away the people's confidence in their own future. The Weimar government tried to maintain the appearance of order, but every attempt to fulfill the imposed reparations resulted in more misery. France demanded coal, steel, gold. Germany, without reserves, paid with what it could: paper. In 1921, the mark began to lose value. In 1922, it lost meaning. A loaf of bread cost 250 marks in January 1923, reported a Berlin housewife in her diary. In November, it cost 200 billion. In bakeries, prices changed hour by hour. Owners wrote new values in chalk on the doors, while customers ran desperate before the money lost value again. Workers received wages twice a day, so their wives could rush to the market and exchange what was still possible. The images from that era are almost surreal. Children playing with piles of notes as if they were building blocks. Workers pushing wheelbarrows full of money. People burning bills in stoves because the paper warmed more than it was worth. National dignity was being consumed, note by note. And while the people suffered, the speeches ignited. The nascent Weimar Republic, democratic and modern, was seen by many as a government of cowards. The myth of the stab in the back, the idea that Germany had been betrayed by politicians, Jews, and communists, gained strength. Defeat ceased to be a military fact and became a moral narrative. And narratives are always more powerful than statistics. In the beer halls of Munich, veterans gathered to lament the past and imagine revenges. Among them, a wiry man with a narrow mustache and feverish gaze began to be heard. Adolf Hitler, a frustrated painter and former soldier, spoke as if channeling collective hatred into short, direct, inflammatory phrases. He offered no solutions, only culprits, and that was enough. Meanwhile, the crisis reached its extreme point in 1923, when France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr Valley, the main German industrial region, to ensure payment of reparations. It was the last straw. The population reacted with strikes, sabotage, and shutdowns. The government, with no other choice, began printing even more money to pay the strikers. And so the value of the mark plunged into an abyss. In November of that year, inflation reached the breaking point. One American dollar equaled 4.2 trillion marks. The German monetary system simply collapsed. Entire families lost everything: savings, homes, inheritances. The middle class, the backbone of the country, was destroyed. And in the void that remained, resentment flourished. It is important to understand, it was there, not in 1939, that the Second World War began to be gestated. Not on battlefields, but in breadlines. Not in arms factories, but in bill factories. The true enemy of peace is not armed conflict, it is the humiliation that comes before it. The victor's mistake was not just economic punishment, but the absence of political compassion. They believed that suffering would keep Germany docile. They forgot that prolonged pain never breeds submission, it breeds rage. And rage is an energy that always finds a conductor. When hyperinflation was finally controlled, it was too late. The country's soul was broken. The people had learned to distrust everything: the currency, the government, democracy. Distrust became culture. Fear became identity. At the end of 1923, the failed Munich Putsch, the attempt by Hitler and his allies to seize power, was merely a prelude. The country was not ready to accept him, but it no longer believed in anyone else. The storm would still take 10 years to arrive, but the thunder could already be heard. The Treaty of Versailles had fulfilled its promise. It prevented Germany from fighting for a time, but at the same time it fulfilled something no one foresaw. It gave it a new cause. The nation ceased to be merely a territory. It became an open wound. And wounds, when ignored, do not heal. 132 billion marks. That was the impossible number haunting Germany since Versailles. But in 1924, a solution appeared. The Dawes Plan. Created by the United States, it reorganized the reparations and injected money into the German economy through international loans. The flow of dollars began to flood the country, sustaining industries, rebuilding factories, fueling consumption. For the first time in nearly a decade, the people breathed. The ground in Germany stopped shaking. The mark was replaced by a new currency, the Rentenmark, and the streets of Berlin filled again. Cafes overflowed, newspapers spoke of recovery, and life seemed to resume a normal rhythm. But what seemed like a rebirth was, in truth, a disguise, a brief interlude between two tragedies. Salvation came from outside, and that was the problem. Germany was not growing by its own strength, but by the temporary confidence of American investors. The system was as fragile as glass. All it took was a crack in the world economy for everything to shatter. Still, optimism took hold of daily life. The cities shone again. Berlin became a symbol of modernity, cinemas, theaters, cars on the streets, skyscrapers and electric lights. It was the Weimar era, a cultural explosion that seemed to contradict the recent trauma. Art, science, music and philosophy flourished. Painters like Otto Dix depicted urban decadence with brutal realism. Writers like Thomas Mann and Bertolt Brecht used words like scalpels, cutting through the illusions of the new society. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the industrial gears turned again. Krupp, Siemens, IG Farben, companies that had been limited by the Treaty of Versailles, now prospered under the mantle of civilian economy. But many of their engineers, war veterans, maintained a double mindset. They designed agricultural machines that could, with minor modifications, become tanks, civilian planes that could be adapted for combat. It was the silent return of the military mentality. The Weimar government, trying to balance democratic politics with pressure from foreign powers, danced on a tightrope. On one side, conservatives and nationalists demanded an end to external dependence. On the other, communists, inspired by the Russian Revolution, called for a total change of the system. In the middle, a weary population just wanted stability. But stability is always an illusion when it depends on what one does not control. The same American money that sustained German factories was inflating the Wall Street bubble. The same credit that fed prosperity hid the abyss that would open just a few years later. In 1929, Germany seemed reborn. The streets were full of advertisements, cars, and shop windows. The youth, disillusioned with old traditions, embraced a new way of living, fast, free, modern. It was the generation of jazz, cabarets, and light politics. No one wanted to remember the past. The entire country seemed determined to forget. But forgetting has a price. The wound of national pride had not healed. It had merely been covered with shine and music. First World War veterans continued to be forgotten, living in shelters and drinking in silence. Inequality persisted. While some danced to the sound of orchestras in Berlin, rural peasants still went hungry. And in the shadows of this false prosperity, extremist groups reorganized. The National Socialist Party, which had failed in the putsch of 1923, began to restructure. Hitler, released from prison after writing Mein Kampf, watched the country with patience and coldness. He knew Germany did not need to be conquered by force. It was enough to wait for it to collapse on its own again.
Time and the economy would do for him what speeches still could not. And that time came quickly. In October 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. 13 million shares were sold in panic in a single day. The world went into shock. The money sustaining the German miracle evaporated overnight. Within months, factories closed, banks failed, unemployment skyrocketed. The Rentenmark, symbol of stability, lost its value again. Germany, once more, found itself on the brink of the abyss. Only this time, despair would come accompanied by something new. A silent, mature, organized rage and waiting for a leader who promised not just food, but redemption.
In 1930, the squares and streets filled again, but not with music, with marches. The same men who had danced in cabarets now marched under red and black flags. The Weimar Republic began to crumble, and in the ruins, the forgotten mistake of 1919 breathed again. The illusion of recovery was over. The dream of peace turned, once more, into a prelude to destruction. 6 million unemployed. That was the number defining Germany in 1930. The New York Stock Exchange crash in 1929 was the silent trigger of a chain reaction that no one could contain. Within months, the international credit sustaining the German economy vanished. Factories stopped, banks went bankrupt, and soup lines returned to the streets. Hope turned to ashes. The miracle of the 1920s had revealed its true face, a mirage sustained by foreign promises. Germany returned to being a country of hunger and rage. And on that fertile ground, radical ideas germinated again. The Weimar democracy, already weakened by distrust and internal divisions, was now seen as the symbol of failure. Every political speech seemed distant, every promise empty. The people wanted no more explanations. They wanted redemption. Amid this social collapse, a voice re-emerged from the shadows. Adolf Hitler, the former soldier who years before had been imprisoned for an attempted coup, reappeared with a much more calculated speech. He had learned from failure. He realized that brute force would not conquer Germany, but despair would. "I offer no politics," he declared at a rally in 1930. "I offer faith." His party, the NSDAP, began to reorganize methodically. Propaganda, symbols, uniforms, anthems, slogans. The aesthetics of power preceded power itself. Red flags with the swastika multiplied in squares, on walls, in marches. The Nazi Party sold not just an ideology, but a feeling. Order amid chaos. While other political forces fragmented into debates and fragile coalitions, Hitler spoke directly to instinct. The promise was simple: a great Germany again, free from the humiliations of Versailles, prosperous and united. Guilt would be erased, enemies punished, and pride restored. The economic crisis, therefore, did not create Hitler. It merely opened space for him to become inevitable. Industrialists, fearing the advance of communism, saw him as a convenient barrier. The elite, exhausted by democratic instability, believed a strong government would restore order. The military, humiliated by the treaty's restrictions, saw in him the chance to rebuild the army. And the people, lost between hunger and nostalgia, saw in the leader a mirror of their own resentment. Meanwhile, Nazi propaganda refined itself. Films, posters, and speeches transformed the Führer into an almost mystical figure. He did not speak of economics, but of destiny. He did not promise reforms, but redemption. It was the opposite of Weimar bureaucracy, a man of action in a paralyzed country. The engineering of Nazi power was above all emotional engineering. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, understood that truth mattered less than the feeling it aroused. A lie repeated 1,000 times becomes truth. And he repeated it. In 1932, the Nazi Party became the largest in Germany. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor. The forgotten mistake of 1919 completed its cycle. The punishment meant to keep Germany submissive had created the Germany that desired revenge. And that revenge now had a face, a voice, and an implacable political machine. In the first months in power, Hitler moved with surgical precision. A fire in the Reichstag, conveniently attributed to communists, justified emergency measures. Civil liberties were suspended. The opposition was dissolved. Within months, German democracy was transformed into a dictatorship from within without needing a coup. Factories returned to operation. Unemployment plummeted. The country seemed reborn. But the price of prosperity was total obedience. And while the people applauded the economic recovery, the most dangerous gear began to turn, the one of militarization. Engineers and industrialists, once limited, received orders to resume weapons production. Civilian planes began to be adapted. Tanks, disguised as tractors, were reassembled, and entire factories were reconfigured under the guise of infrastructure programs, all with frightening efficiency. German youth was mobilized. The Hitler Youth trained millions of children in discipline, obedience, and leader worship. In schools, history was rewritten. In cinemas, films exalted sacrifice for the nation. In the streets, parades showed a unified, strong, reborn country. The Germany of 1933 was the opposite of the Germany of 1919. Humiliation had been replaced by exaltation, despair by obedience. And the man who had promised to restore national pride was about to turn the world into a testing ground for a nation's vengeance. The forgotten mistake of Versailles ceased to be a consequence. It became a cause. The storm had begun. The Germany of 1933 seemed finally upright. The streets were clean. Factories returned to work. Newspapers spoke of national rebirth. Unemployment, which had devastated the country, fell month by month. For the first time in a generation, the people saw signs of hope. But beneath this appearance of prosperity, something much deeper and darker was being built. What the world saw as an economic miracle was, in truth, the birth of the war machine. Hitler and his ministers knew that national pride needed concrete foundations. It was not enough to talk of glory, it had to be produced. And so began the plan to transform the civilian economy into a military one. Engineering became doctrine, production became faith. Every factory, every worker, every engineer began to work not just for a salary, but for an ideal, rebuilding Germany as an irresistible force. Hitler's government understood that obedience is born of belonging. Social policies were shaped for that. The Strength Through Joy program organized vacations, sports, trips, and even affordable cars. The famous Volkswagen, literally the people's car. People believed they were participating in a collective rebirth, but every benefit was a gear of control. The state became the provider, and in return demanded loyalty. At the heart of the economy, Minister Hjalmar Schacht performed an accounting miracle. Germany had no gold or international credit, but began financing massive public works and secret rearmament. The trick was simple and ingenious. Fictitious notes called MIFO bills used to pay suppliers without recording formal debts. It was as if the country lived on an invisible currency, sustained by the collective belief that victory would make everything payable. That belief became religion. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda sold the image of a unified, disciplined, pure people.
Posters showed happy families, smiling soldiers, fertile fields. Reality, however, was a disguised mobilization. Automobile factories produced engines that could be adapted for tanks. Airlines training civilian pilots formed future fighter pilots. Universities taught physics and chemistry under the pretext of scientific progress, but with clear military objectives. The regime transformed everything into symbol. The road, the radio, and the cinema. Nothing was merely what it seemed. The Autobahns, national pride, cut the country from end to end. 3,000 kilometers of highways were built in just 3 years. Officially, they were infrastructure works for the people. In practice, they were strategic corridors for troop movement. The radio, present in almost every home, broadcast speeches and anthems that made the population believe it was living the grandest era in German history.
And there was something hypnotic in this order. After years of chaos, inflation, and humiliation, the feeling of stability was intoxicating. The people saw concrete results: work, food, pride. Few asked the price. Few wanted to know. Silence became part of the pact. Fear and euphoria walked side by side. German engineering, fueled by this new fervor, flourished like never before. Military design blurred with art. The sound of engines, the gleam of steel, the symmetry of machines, all was treated as an expression of national identity. Every technical advance was a moral victory. Engineers became the new heroes, and efficiency the new virtue. But rearmament had an invisible price. It depended on expansion. Germany needed more resources, more metals, more fuel. The machine that had been assembled demanded constant motion. An entire country turned like a gear, unable to stop. And when a machine cannot stop, it must advance, even if it means crushing what lies ahead. In 1935, Hitler openly broke with the Treaty of Versailles. He re-established compulsory military service, announced the creation of an air force, and began displaying tanks in public parades. The world watched in astonishment and inaction. France hesitated, Britain preached patience, the United States looked inward. No country wanted to believe that the mistake of 1919 had returned. The following year, 1936, came the decisive step: the remilitarization of the Rhineland. German troops crossed the border and occupied the demilitarized zone separating Germany from France. It was a direct violation of the treaty and a risky gamble. Hitler would later admit, "If the French had marched into the Rhineland, we would have had to retreat with our tails between our legs." But they did not react. No shots were fired. The silence of the powers was interpreted as permission. And so, without war, without resistance, without sanction, Hitler discovered the most dangerous truth of the century. The fear of conflict is the best weapon of those who desire it. The German people believed they were living a rebirth. The world believed it was living in peace. And between these two illusions, the engine of destruction began to roar. The machine of redemption was ready. What was missing now was the pretext, and it would come soon. From 1936 onward, Germany stopped pretending. Rearmament was no longer a secret, it was a spectacle. The Nuremberg rallies became rituals of political faith, columns of tanks, planes flying in formation overhead, crowds synchronized like human gears. The entire country seemed to pulse in the same rhythm. And at the center of it all, the man who had promised redemption watched with the gaze of one who already saw farther. Hitler knew that restoring German pride was not enough. It had to prove its superiority. The Reich's ideology needed to be tested, and war was the ideal laboratory. The opportunity came quickly.
In July 1936, Spain plunged into civil war. Nationalists against Republicans, right against left, an internal conflict that for Germany and fascist Italy would be the perfect rehearsal ground. Under the pretext of supporting General Francisco Franco, Hitler sent the Condor Legion, a contingent of Luftwaffe pilots and engineers. Officially, it was technical aid. In practice, it was a large-scale military test. Planes, tactics, weapons, bombings, everything would be experimented there with the blood of another country. On April 26, 1937, the small Basque town of Guernica was bombed into ashes. 1,600 people died in a few hours. No significant military target, just civilians. The whole world was shocked. Pablo Picasso would immortalize the horror in his most famous painting. For the Germans, Guernica was an operational success. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated the power of coordinated air attack, the basis of the future Blitzkrieg. For Hitler, modern war would no longer be one of stationary armies, but of speed, precision, and terror.
Meanwhile, in Germany, the gear of power closed. The regime controlled everything: press, education, culture. Youth were molded from an early age by the Hitler Youth. Faith in the leader replaced critical thinking. The individual dissolved into the collective. The Nazi state had created something unprecedented, a nation disciplined like a machine and fanatical like a sect. The years from 1936 to 1938 were the peak of this transformation. The economy spun at full speed. The arms industry operated 24 hours a day. The number of soldiers grew dizzyingly. Germany produced more steel and fuel than any other European country. Everything pointed to prosperity, but it was artificial prosperity, fueled by a single goal: war. The new Reich had ceased to be a promise. It was now a tangible, powerful, feared reality. And the more powerful it became, the more isolated the world around it grew. The fear and indecision of the Western powers gave Hitler the confidence of a gambler who already knew the table was his. In March 1938, he took the step that would seal Europe's fate: the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. Without firing a single shot, Germany absorbed an entire country. German troops crossed the border, greeted by ecstatic crowds, swastika flags waving in the streets of Vienna, and the leader, triumphant, speaking as if destiny had merely corrected an injustice. The world watched with horror disguised as prudence. France protested timidly. Britain fell silent. The United States remained neutral. The invasion of a sovereign country was treated as an internal matter of German-speaking peoples, and Hitler understood what he already suspected. The fear of conflict was the shield that would allow him to advance. Rearmament was no longer defense, it was doctrine. Every territorial conquest was also an ideological triumph. The people saw the leader as a military genius, the restorer of lost honor. Industrialists saw rising profits, endless contracts, full factories. Generals, though skeptical, obeyed. And so, amid applause and marches, Germany returned to dominating Europe without anyone daring to resist. Meanwhile, the forgotten mistake of 1919 completed its metamorphosis. The punishment of Versailles, created to weaken Germany, had forged a regime that turned weakness into strength and shame into fuel. What the victors of the First World War called justice now revealed itself as the starting point of a carefully planned revenge. In the fall of 1938, Hitler looked at the map of Europe and saw his next step: Czechoslovakia. The pretext would be the same as always: protecting German minorities in the Sudeten region. The method, too: pressure, intimidation, propaganda. And once again, the world would choose silence. In Munich, in September of that year, the Western powers signed a new agreement with the Führer. He promised peace in exchange for the Sudeten land. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to London proclaiming he had secured peace for our time. And Hitler, smiling, knew that the time of peace had ended. Guernica had been the rehearsal, Austria the validation. Czechoslovakia would be just another step. The gear of domination was complete. Germany no longer needed to pretend. It had the power, the people, and the world's fear on its side. War now was no longer a question of if, but of when. The year 1938 ended with the world breathing a sigh of relief and completely deceived. The Munich Agreement seemed to have contained Germany. Newspapers celebrated diplomacy. People believed that, this time, peace would prevail. But beneath this apparent calm, Hitler laughed in silence. Every signature on that document was to him a confession of weakness. Every handshake a disguised surrender. Germany had achieved another victory without firing a single shot. With the annexation of the Sudeten land, Hitler secured not just territory, but symbolic power. He showed Europe that he could dictate the terms of the game. The German population, intoxicated by success, now saw him as an almost divine figure, the man who challenged the world and won. Berlin's streets were filled with parades, flags, and speeches. The applause was so deafening that it drowned out any doubt. But there was a problem. The machine he had created could not stop. The army needed more steel, the factories more fuel, and the ideology more conquest. Germany was like an engine at maximum rotation. If it slowed, it would explode from within. Hitler knew this. The next step was inevitable. The next target was to the east, Poland, a country that, in the Führer's eyes, was merely an obstacle between Germany and its living space, the Lebensraum, which he believed was the natural destiny of the German people. But there was a risk. Attacking Poland meant facing France and Britain, who had promised to protect it. It was necessary to ensure that, when the attack came, the Eastern Front remained silent. And so was born one of the most cynical agreements in history, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23, 1939, a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, two ideologically opposed regimes united by convenience. Stalin declared publicly, "I see no reason for the Soviet Union to shed a drop of blood for capitalist interests." In the secret annex of the pact, the two dictators divided Eastern Europe like a map on a game board. Poland would be split in half. The world was shocked and, at the same time, paralyzed. No country believed Hitler would really dare cross the line. Voices calling for action were drowned out by a collective fear of reliving the trauma of 1914. Western democracies convinced themselves there was still time, that perhaps the dictator would content himself with what he already had. But time had run out. In the early morning of September 1, 1939, Germany attacked, without a declaration of war, without warning. The pretext was a farce. German soldiers, dressed in Polish uniforms, simulated an attack on a radio station on the border. Hours later, 1.5 million German soldiers crossed into Polish territory. Tanks, artillery, and planes moved in perfect synchrony. It was the first demonstration of the new military method, the Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Poland resisted bravely, but it was alone. While Warsaw burned, the West hesitated. France and Britain declared war on Germany 2 days later, but neither acted in fact. The conflict began with words and weights, while German columns advanced as if the entire world had given up resisting. Blitzkrieg was not just a military strategy. It was the final product of 20 years of resentment and reconstruction. Every piece, every engine, every calculation made since 1919 converged in that instant. The German army was not the largest, but it was the fastest, the most precise, the most disciplined. Modern war had begun there, and the world was not prepared for it. On September 17, fulfilling its part of the agreement, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. The country was destroyed in less than a month.
Warsaw surrendered on September 27 after weeks of relentless bombings. And when Hitler appeared on the map of Europe as owner of half of it, it became clear that the mistake of Versailles had reached its peak of irony. The treaty, meant to guarantee peace, had created the army that destroyed the continent. As German troops marched, the Führer's speeches echoed across Europe. We did not want this war. We were forced into it. The world, once again, half believed. The lie was repeated with enough conviction to confuse those who still wanted to believe in logic. But logic had died with the previous century. What began there was not just the Second World War, it was the definitive collapse in faith in human reason. The engine of destruction, ignited 20 years earlier in Versailles, now roared at full power. The forgotten mistake, the one no one wanted to see, had transformed into the greatest tragedy of modern history. In 6 years, 70 million people would die. Entire cities would disappear. The map of Europe would be redrawn by fire, and the price of forgetting, once again, would be paid in blood. The line had been crossed, and on the other side, there was only abyss. History rarely repeats itself in the same way, but it has the bad habit of rhyming, and the echo that began in the Hall of Mirrors in 1919 still resonates today. The forgotten mistake that ignited the Second World War was not just a poorly drafted treaty, nor the arrogance of the victors, nor the resentment of the defeated. It was something deeper, more human, and more dangerous: the illusion that it is possible to build peace through humiliation and order through fear. When the Treaty of Versailles was signed, the world believed it was eliminating the German danger, but by reducing an entire nation to guilt, by stripping it of the right to hope, an open wound was created. And open wounds do not heal, they infect. Punishment replaced justice, pride replaced dialogue, and the consequence was inevitable. The mistake was not punishing Germany too much, it was failing to understand that no society accepts living eternally on its knees. Winston Churchill would admit in 1946, the Second War was avoidable. It was the unnecessary war. Misery breeds revolt, humiliation generates ideology, and lack of listening opens space for demagogues who promise greatness in exchange for blind obedience. Hitler did not invent that feeling. He merely organized it. He turned resentment into purpose, frustration into force. And what began as a peace signature became the most dangerous formula of all: wounded pride plus despair equals war.
But the mistake did not stop in 1939. It continues to repeat itself, just with other names, other flags, other speeches. Just look around. The same forces that moved the world between wars are still alive. Economic crises that feed hatred and nationalism. Entire populations feeling forgotten, seeking leaders who promise to restore a past that never existed. Fear transformed into a political tool. Disinformation used as a weapon. And, above all, the belief that guilt is always the other's. In 1919, the victorious powers believed they could impose peace through punishment. Today, in many places, the world believes it can maintain stability through polarization and control. Yesterday, the enemy was the internal traitor. Today, it is the neighbor who thinks differently. Languages, means, technologies change, but the pattern is the same. Isolation, resentment, and collective ego continue to light invisible fuses. The interwar Germany is the distorted mirror of any society that in times of crisis trades empathy for arrogance and dialogue for imposition. It was so when unemployment destroyed families and despair turned to rage. It is so now when fear of the other is sold as a solution. And if there is something history insists on proving, it is that every time a nation begins to talk more about purity, honor, and redemption, the sound of boots is not far off. The forgotten mistake, therefore, does not belong to the past. It is a process, not an event. It begins with economic collapse, grows in disinformation, flourishes in polarization, and explodes in dehumanization. In 1919, it took the form of a treaty. in 1933 of a speech, in 1939 of an invasion, and today it can manifest in other wars, of ideas, of borders, of narratives. What history screams at us is that danger is not born of chaos but of certainty. Hitler did not rise amid disorder, he rose when he promised absolute order. The promise of stability is the oldest chant of tyrants, and it always begins with a phrase that seems harmless. This is for the good of our people. The forgotten mistake that ignited the Second World War was believing that humiliation could be the basis of peace. The mistake the world is about to repeat is believing that division can be the basis of security. The flame that burned Europe nearly a century ago was not born of tanks. It was born of pride, denial, and indifference. In 1919, the world punished one people too much and pushed it into the abyss. In 2025, the world risks committing the opposite, ignoring the cracks too much, pretending nothing is about to collapse. We watch again as leaders emerge who promise to make the country great again, who blame minorities for complex crises, who attack democratic institutions in the name of the will of the people. The ingredients are the same, only the labels have changed. The mistake is the same, forgetting that peace requires constant effort, not imposition, dialogue, not silence, empathy, not victory. History is not a patient teacher, it is an implacable force that punishes those who refuse to learn. And perhaps that is the true meaning of remembering, not to point fingers, but to recognize patterns, because the past does not disappear, it waits. It waits for fear to return, for arrogance to return, for blindness to return. It waits for someone, again, to believe they can shape others' destinies by force. The Treaty of Versailles should have been a warning about the dangers of revenge disguised as justice. It should have taught that humiliated nations do not accept their fate. They conspire against it. It should have shown that peace treaties written without compassion are merely contracts for postponed war. But the lesson was forgotten, and the price of forgetting was 70 million lives. Today, as the world fragments again into ideological blocks, as the rhetoric of national superiority resurges, as international agreements are torn up in the name of national interest, the forgotten mistake whispers its warning. History is ready to rhyme again. The question is not whether we will remember the past. The question is whether we will recognize it when it knocks at the door dressed in new clothes. The forgotten mistake ignited the Second World War, and if humanity continues to believe that power replaces understanding, that humiliation replaces justice, and that memory is optional, then history, inevitably, will rhyme again. The choice, as always, is ours, but the time to choose is running out, and the clock has already begun to tick.